Attempt to summarize Unit 3, which has been all about this phenomenon of the marathon runner. We saw these women and they were finishing the marathon and they collapsed right before the finish line. And the announcers, they said, oh, they're going to be fine. And that seemed a little bit odd to us, but it was because these announcers have seen this happen before. So this is a phenomenon that can happen. Their muscles, their body literally just kind of failed them in the last second. And so we're trying to unpack why that might be, how that could have happened. So to start with, we kind of started asking ourselves, well, just how do humans regulate during intense activity? Like what's kind of the normal state? And so to unpack that, the very first thing we did was a little exercise lab. So this was learning target 1, because if we look at learning target 1, actually, learning target 1 says I can conduct and evaluate an investigation to illustrate the body's ability to maintain homeostasis using multiple body systems. So this was us conducting our investigation, and what we figured out was the fact that, unsurprisingly, when you exercise, your pulse and your breathing rate increased. But why is that? Well, in order to exercise, you need energy, which we now know from Unit 2 is all about ATP. How do we make that energy? Through cellular respiration, aerobic respiration. And what do we need in order to perform cellular respiration? Oxygen and glucose. This is building off of our background from Unit 2. So, specifically that oxygen, how do we get it? Through breathing. And how does that oxygen travel from our lungs to our muscles? Through our blood, pumped by our heart. So, in order to get more oxygen to account for this process happening more, you would need to breathe more to get more oxygen in, and you would need your heart to pump faster to get it to where it needs to go. Interestingly enough, though, a lot of this is actually regulated by the carbon dioxide production. The more carbon dioxide you produce as a result of cellular respiration slightly alters your body's pH, which triggers your body to want to increase your breathing rate to get that carbon dioxide out of your body. And all of that is to maintain homeostasis. So homeostasis is all about inner balance. It's actually one of the characteristics of life. The idea that living things want to maintain stable inner conditions. And we learned that there's kind of 2 ways that your body is controlling that: negative feedback and positive feedback. So what we did in order to learn about that, you had a reading that you did quadrant notes on, and then you had some practice problems. So if we pull up these practice problems, things that you would be expected to be able to do on a test is to identify the different components within a homeostatic feedback loop: the stimulus, the receptor, control center, effector, and response. We mentioned that the stimulus and the response are actions. Receptor, control center, and effector tend to be like the body parts that are doing those actions. And in terms of negative feedback, what we look for is that it's bringing the body back to normal. So usually the response is the opposite of the stimulus. And a classic example is temperature. So when you get too cold, you shiver, warms your body back up. When you get too hot, you sweat, brings your body back down. And if you graph this, it kind of looks like it's oscillating around this homeostatic perfect level there. Conversely, positive feedback loop, it's when you are going away from normal in order to accomplish a task. And so your response is going to be the same as your stimulus. And if we were to graph this, you'll see that, oh, here it's kind of like normal, but then whoa, it goes way further and further away from kind of that normal homeostatic level until you accomplish a task, and then it comes crashing back down. A great example of this is adrenaline. If you are trying to run away from a bear, all of a sudden your adrenaline is going to be spiked, and it's going to give you more and more adrenaline until you're safely away from that bear. And then once you reach that safety, your body can kind of regulate and you'll just go back to kind of normal. But your response got heightened more and more and more adrenaline until you reach that particular task or accomplished whatever it is that your body was trying to accomplish. In the bear example, safety, away from the bear. So 2 ways to kind of keep your body balanced is what we were looking at. And so that's really important if we're thinking about how these marathon runners can run an entire marathon. Throughout the full length of the marathon, their bodies are doing all of this like regulation on kind of micro levels to keep them at a stable inner condition so that they can perform. But there's more to it than that. So kind of going back to this idea of these molecules and the energy that we need, that ATP, we need to ask ourselves, well, how do humans get and store energy? And you might be saying to yourself, we already know this. We learned this last unit. We know that it's cellular respiration. And it's like, yes, that is the process that's involved in getting that ATP, but where are we getting the molecules from? How are we getting them throughout our body to where they need to go, both on a body scale and on a more like cellular level scale, and kind of zooming in at that molecular scale as well. So we're kind of playing with scale here in this unit. So in order to tackle this, we had learning target 2, which is all about macromolecules and their purpose. So if we take a look at our learning target sheet here, it says I can use models to relate macromolecule consumption to their purpose and their ability to provide energy for the body and the cells. So what did we do to tackle that? We had this first worksheet about macromolecules and their energy. And what this was getting at is the fact that our food nutrition labels include things like fats, which are lipids, carbohydrates, and proteins for a reason. It's because they're giving us calories. And calories or kilocalories, it's just a measure of unit of energy, essentially. So all of those types of macromolecules can provide energy. But carbohydrates are the ones that are going to give us that quick, fast source of energy because there's more breakable bonds that involve carbon atoms is kind of the chemistry side of it. So that's why carbohydrates are our body's first source of energy. Then it'll break down lipids if it needs to, and only as like a last resort would it start to break down your proteins, which is good. You don't want it breaking down your proteins. And we looked at the fact that the more kind of monomers you put together into a polymer, the more potential there is for energy storage. So glucose, put a bunch of them together, you get starch essentially. And then similarly though on a animal side, because really only plants are making the starch, what we do with all of our excess glucose is we build it and store it as something called glycogen. So it's kind of the animal equivalent of starch. And if you were to zoom in on the structure of it here, it's really just a bunch of glucose molecules shoved together essentially. Alrighty. So then we also looked at macromolecules and their purpose. So yes, they have purpose in terms of energy, but they're also so important for a ton of other processes within our body and within our cell. So we asked you to do this reading and to take a look at the function of these macromolecules on the body scale and on the cell scale. If you're stuck on some of those, these videos are great for kind of summarizing some of those purposes. The reading is great. Yeah. So we learned all about their purpose. Then once we realized how important they were on all of those different scales, we had to ask ourselves, okay, cool, but how do we get these molecules to where they need to be within the body? And so we looked at that through this idea of cell transport of molecules. So how do they go from one cell to another? How do they enter a cell? How do they leave a cell? And it turns out it depends a lot on the molecule itself, because these cells here, and this is a better picture because it shows kind of that you can see all of the how thick this like membrane would be. Like this is you kind of like looking at it from the surface versus this looking at the cell straight sideways. We've got this phospholipid bilayer. So bilayer meaning it's 2 layers, 2 levels of these phospholipids, fats. And then you can also see in these pictures protein channels. So already we're getting at functions of proteins and functions of lipids right here in the makeup of our cells and their structure. So molecules that are small and nonpolar can slip right through the cell membrane here. But if they're polar, they're going to interact with these hydrophilic heads here. Or if they're too large, they literally just can't slip through this phospholipid bilayer, like through the gaps in the phospholipids. And so if that's the case, then they need the help of a protein channel, like we would see here. In both of those examples, we diffusion. It's just a matter of if it's simple diffusion or facilitated diffusion, because it's requiring no energy because the molecules are moving from a high concentration to a low concentration. And fun fact, osmosis is diffusion, but specifically of water molecules. Biology just felt the need to give water its own vocab word in terms of diffusion because of how important it is. So we saw this in action with our gummy bear lab. So we've moved on here to learning target 3, which is all about just the purpose of the macromolecules, but how do they move across the membranes for maintaining homeostasis at a cellular level. And so we learned that through our gummy bear lab. And our gummy bear lab was showing us technically osmosis. It was the movement of water, and it was water moving into the gummy bear or out of the gummy bear. Now, spoiler alert for the answer of the lab here, the gummy bears in the zero molarity solution got the biggest. Why? Well, the zero molarity solution didn't have any salt added to it. The rest of them had various levels of salt concentration within the solution that the gummy bear was sitting in. So that meant that the gummy bear was sitting in essentially pure water. So it was all water molecules. So the concentration of water molecules outside of the gummy bear was higher than the concentration of water within the gummy bear. And so the water molecule, no different than any other molecule, is going to want to go from want to anthropomorphize it to go from high concentration to low concentration. So the water then went from the solution and into the gummy bear, which was not just water. It had a whole bunch, it had sugar and salt and all kinds of other molecules in there. So of course the concentration of water inside the gummy bear was less than in that zero molarity of the solution that it was sitting in. So that's why the gummy bear got bigger. The water went into it. However, you took this a step further and you kind of summarized all of these different molecular transports through this reading. So you had one reading that kind of summarized it in terms of the gummy bear lab, brought in those terms, osmosis, passive transport versus active transport. And then you learned about it from the context of a cell with some really great visuals in here as well. So this has some awesome examples of facilitated diffusion. So water, when it's going through a cell membrane, is technically facilitated diffusion. It needs to go through an aquaporin because water is polar. Glucose, facilitated diffusion, needs to go through this protein channel because it is just too large to do simple diffusion. So both facilitated diffusion. And then it also introduced this idea of active transport where you need energy to pump the molecules, because in that case, it's talking about examples of things going from low concentration to high concentration. Against that concentration gradient, you would need energy, ATP, in order to make that happen. So it was another example of the importance of ATP. And I believe that concludes learning targets 1 through 3. So we now know our body's trying to maintain homeostasis on a body scale. It's also trying to maintain it on a cellular scale. The importance here is these macromolecules are really controlling the structure and the function of our bodies. Carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. We know their importance now on a cellular level and a body system and level. And we know now how they can move throughout the body. Well, really from one cell to another. What we need to talk about next is how they can move throughout the body. So zooming out large scale, but I'm going to pause it here.